Hello there, and welcome to PoliTalks. And today we will be reviewing the 2022 Senate map, and we will be making a prediction for both chambers of Congress, and we'll do a bit of a deep dive into the governor's map. And with this is my 5 or 6 days, I should say, out till the election prediction for the 2022 midterms, and we are approaching the final stretch. I'd say at this point, most voters will have their preferred choice in mind, and this stretch of the campaign is really all about motivating turnout and inspiring getting out the vote efforts in crucial swing states and districts. So let's just go on and dive right on in. So we'll start with the safe states for each party. I think it's quite obvious, although I think it's still interesting to discuss what's actually likely versus safe, because that can give us an insight into how the national trends look. For example, if Vermont was likely for Democrats, then that would be a very, very poor situation. Likewise, if state like South Dakota was likely for Republicans, both of those would be very poor predicaments and signal a very unfavorable national environment. Although I don't think we have that kind of level of swing in this election. I think of the most recent midterm elections, this one is probably one of the most balanced in terms of national trend. Republicans definitely are favored as of now, but you compare that to 2018, 2014, 2010, you can kind of see kind of a contrast. And I suppose that is good news for the Democrats because they're avoiding the worst case scenario, although it still means they will most likely lose both chambers of Congress, as I will explore today. So, starting with safe states, I was mentioning it earlier, Vermont, of course, and then California, that one's quite self-explanatory. There are actually two elections occurring in California for the Senate because of an odd sort of legal requirement that stipulates that there must also be a special election, but for our purposes that does not matter. Effectively, there is only one Senate race in California, and Alex Padilla is the clear favorite in both of them. So, moving on, I would say we could also characterize Oregon as a safe blue Senate seat, and I'd say many people may be surprised by this, although the incumbent senator there is actually quite popular in contrast with the Democratic governor, so I don't think he will be dragged down too much by Kate Brown, the governor. And while this could end up going to likely, I still think just because of his popularity and the fact that Oregon is still in its essence a blue state, this will likely be a safe margin. But to be fair, this doesn't make a huge impact either, because it's pretty clear either way that Democrats will win the seat. And then, I'd say, of course, Maryland is also looking like one. I think there was some discussion earlier about if Larry Hogan, the very popular Republican governor of Maryland, ran in that seat, he would win. I still don't think he would, but that would definitely not be a safe margin in that case. But just scanning the rest of the map, and I am not seeing. Oh, Connecticut, I don't believe that one's turning out to be likely, although it's not impossible. And New York is a very tricky one. I'm actually not sure how to characterize this. I'm gonna go with safe for now, just because of, Chuck Schumer's base and support, and yes, he is controversial, but in New York, I really don't think he'll have much of a problem, and I do expect that, just to clarify my margins also, I use tilt 0 to 1, lean 1 to 5, and likely 5 to 15. So, I do think this will be slightly over 15 points for Chuck Schumer, although it's definitely possible that narrows up. And in terms of safe blue states, I believe that is all. However, Republicans actually, I do believe, have a great deal more safe Republican seats, although that is to be expected. We do have, seats like Kentucky, and Kansas, and North Dakota and South Dakota. We're certainly not going to be seeing Kansas anywhere close, despite the abortion referendum earlier this year. Alabama, of course, South Carolina. Florida, I'll come back to later. I wouldn't say it's safe, though. I think for DeSantis, it realistically could be, although for Rubio, I think Val Demings, while not an excellent candidate, has put up enough of a campaign that perhaps that will be under 15 points. Louisiana, of course, Arkansas, both Oklahoma elections. If you don't know why, the incumbent senator for Oklahoma, Jim Inhofe, he resigned, or he will resign in next year. So there's also a special election. Of course, both of those are going to Republicans. And then there's some debates earlier this year and last year, of course, about if Eric Greitens ended up winning the Republican nomination in Missouri, whether this race would narrow up. But we don't have to deal with those hypotheticals anymore because that is not happening. Alaska, I'm going to characterize as safe. Now, if you don't know, this race is actually being contested by three candidates. Two of them are Republicans. One of them is Lisa Murkowski. One of them is Kelly Tshibaka, who is essentially a more conservative, Trump-backed Republican. And then there's a Democrat in this race who also has very little chance, especially because I think many potential Democrat voters will be instead voting for Lisa Murkowski to ensure that she stays in the seat, because she is one of the most bipartisan senators out there. Certainly an improvement from Kelly Tshibaka from a Democratic perspective. And then, let's see, Indiana, of course, not much to say there. Iowa, I'll come back to later, is actually very interesting. Idaho, Utah is a very tricky one, because we do have potentially a shocker in Utah. And this, just to clarify, this is not a Democrat by any means. This is Evan McMillan, who is an independent, self-declared independent. I think he has a chance of winning here. I think it's very low. But I think more than likely he would caucus with the Republicans a majority of the time, so I will just characterize this race as safe Republican. And let me just make sure I'm not missing any. Okay, I think that's pretty good for safe Republican states at this point. Now, you can see there's a lot more safe Republican. Did not mean to do that. There's a lot more safe Republican states than there are safe Democratic seats, but again, that doesn't really mean anything. That's just the characterization of the map. Although you do note that when factoring in safe states alone, Republicans are one seat ahead of Democrats, just to keep in mind. But let's cycle back. Democrats to their likely states. We have Illinois. I do think this state as a whole has kind of been shifting slightly to the right, which may drive it under 15%, but Tammy Duckworth is popular, unlike J.B. Pritzker, the governor. That's a whole nother story. And so I certainly think that she will win, although I'm not confident it will be above 15 points. And then we have New Hampshire, which is somewhat of a controversial one, considering the recent news where Republicans are actually starting to reinvest in New Hampshire. But I just don't think this is doable for Republicans. They have a basically unknown candidate with that's Trumpian in a state that is clearly not Trumpian. If Chris Sununu would have won, I think we would be seeing like maybe a lean or likely red state hero, but Don Bolduc is just not a convincing candidate in the slightest. And I do expect that to be around maybe like 6 points for Maggie Hassan. It could definitely narrow under, but I would be shocked to see Don Bolduc win in New Hampshire. That would have to be a like above 2020 polling error for that to occur. And then in terms of other likely Democratic states, I'm going to put Colorado. Yes, there's been some discussion about whether this could actually narrow up, but I really don't see it. And I do think Michael Bennet, especially since he has won in 2010, mind you, he was never elected. He was the incumbent, he was appointed by the governor, but he had never been elected before, and he won in 2010 when the Republicans won, I think it was 7 seats on the Senate level? Yeah, I believe that's true. So, certainly I think Michael Bennet has a lot of political power in Colorado, and his opponent, while not as poor of a candidate as many others in other states, I do think will end up. I do think we'll end up losing by a likely margin. Now, I'm going to speed this up a bit because I don't think we should have too much discussion of just likely states because, like I said, it's not really going to make much of a difference. So, Florida, that's pretty self-explanatory. Shifting to the right, popular incumbent, fairly weak Democratic candidate that's definitely not going blue anytime soon. And then let's see here. Iowa, there was a poll released recently that showed the Republican in a very narrow race within the margin of error against the Democratic contender. I'm definitely going to take that with a grain of salt, but considering Chuck Grassley's age and the fact that many don't want him to run in the cycle because of that, I do think it will actually end up being maybe like 13 or 14 points. I think that's definitely possible. And then in terms of likely states for Republicans, I believe that's it. And I forgot to mention a likely state for the Democrats, which was Washington. Yes, the Republican is running a decent campaign, and it's certainly possible she narrows it up. But again, I do not think this will be turning red anytime soon, unless we have. Gosh, that would have to be like 3 times the 2020 polling error. I do not think that is likely. Okay, so we've moved into the realm of lean states. So I guess I'll continue with Democrats by our citizens here, so I think the only one here I feel relatively comfortable categorizing as lean Democrat is Arizona here. This one's really controversial. I know many of you are going to be saying that's either Till or lean red, but I just think that, Mark Kelly has been leading for so much of this cycle against Blake Masters, who's also a very poor candidate. I just don't see this one going red, frankly. And I think it will be by a 2 to 3 points. Quite narrow, but that's still a lean margin. I don't think it'll be an extremely close race, although that could definitely change by the time we get to Election Day. And then for Democrats, I believe that is actually it in terms of lean Democratic states. And then Republicans, we have a few actually. North Carolina, which I think a lot of people have been sleeping on. Yes, in 2020, it did end up going to the Republicans when many expected it to go to the Democrats quite easily. Although I do think, first of all, there's that scandal with Cal Cunningham. So I think that definitely played a role. I don't think that was the sole reason why it ended up going to the Republicans, but I do think that played a role. And also, North Carolina usually goes, it's kind of like the equivalent of Nevada for the Democrats. Like, it usually ends up going for the Republicans by around the same margin each year. It doesn't have, like, drastic swings. And that margin tends to be around 2.7, 2.1, 1 point. So, in any event, that's a lean margin. So I do expect that to occur. I don't expect Ted Budd to win by more than 5 points. That doesn't seem likely to me, although it's certainly possible. And then in terms of other lean red states, I'll just do them all now and then explain them one by one. We've got Wisconsin and we've got Ohio. So the thing with Wisconsin is it was actually a very interesting race. We first of all, going into the cycle, we didn't know whether Ron Johnson would actually end up running, and he did end up running, and I don't ultimately know whether that helped the Republicans or hurt them, but in any event, at one point in the cycle, he was down to Democrat Mandela Barnes, but now he seems to have quite a formidable lead against him. Certainly not a likely lead, but he does seem to be regaining that, so I certainly expect Wisconsin to go red this cycle. Kind of a missed opportunity for Democrats alongside Pennsylvania, and maybe North Carolina, and maybe Ohio. It's probably their second best pickup opportunity this cycle. So it's kind of a missed opportunity, but that's politics for you. And then in terms of lean red for Republicans, I believe that's it. And now we're going to move on to the tilts. And there's actually only one. Oh, I forgot to explain Ohio. So Ohio is a very, very interesting race this cycle. Initially, it was seen as safe R if Rob Portman ran again. He absolutely smoked the Democratic challenger, who was a former statewide elected governor in 2016, which wasn't even a drastically favorable year for the GOP. So, like, if Rob Portman ran again, this certainly would be almost certainly, especially with Ohio's recent rightward trend, a safe victory. However, he did not end up running. He decided to retire, and the candidate that the candidate that was elected to take his place, was very, in my opinion, poor candidate. He wasn't the worst. The worst would have been Josh Mandel, the former state treasurer, I believe, and he would have been a terrible pick for Republicans, and this race could potentially be tilt Republican or potentially even tilt Democrat right now if he had been nominated. Although they did choose J.D. Vance, who is a slightly better candidate. He can paint himself as a populist and also kind of strikes a balance between Trumpism and distancing himself from Trump in the past. So he's not the worst candidate by any means, but he certainly isn't a great candidate either. And it doesn't help that the Democratic candidate was possibly one of the best they could have fielded. Tim Ryan, who's also kind of painted himself as a populist and a centrist willing to buck the party line. And he has ran an excellent campaign, and this race has actually narrowed up to a few points in polling, which most people did not expect coming into the cycle. However, I still think, given Ohio's rightward lean and the nature of this year in the national environment, Ohio will end up going red by at least 5 points at least 1 point and probably around 4 or 5 points. Okay, so we are done with the lean Republicans, so now let's move on to the tilt Democrats. There's only one tilt Democrat, actually, and that is Georgia. Now, this one's kind of surprising because Georgia, before the events of a few days ago, which I'll get into, Georgia was actually seen as moving in the Republicans' favor and potentially one of their best pickup opportunities. I mean, look at this. Nevada voted for Hillary Clinton in 2016, and they have a Democratic governor, 2 Democratic senators. Pennsylvania is a very close swing state. There's already a Democrat senator from Pennsylvania. Georgia, before 2020, was completely red. All statewide elective offices, presidential elections since 1992 or 1996 that Georgia has gone blue, but it went blue in 2020, and that was a shocking result, and so Republicans thought this was one of their best pickup opportunities in this year. But it didn't help that they nominated potentially one of the worst candidates imaginable, and that is Herschel Walker, a former football player. And yes, I know, there was a football player running for politics, and I know I try and keep this channel as unbiased as possible, but even I have to say, like, I understand what they're going for with that approach and the populist mindset, but that is simply a poor poach, someone with no electoral experience whatsoever running for a crucial Senate seat. And what's happened in the past few days is allegations have come out against Herschel Walker, alleging he was paying for his girlfriend's abortion, and having children with people that he didn't disclose. So this race, despite the rightward shift of the past few days and weeks, has actually kind of been moving in Democrats' favor due to the aforementioned scandals. However, I do expect it to be very close, potentially even the deciding seat in this year's contest, because it was last year, last year, because it was 2021 the runoffs occurred. And this race could potentially end up going to a runoff, which could potentially determine Senate control. So this could also be an extremely crucial race this cycle. But that is actually the last Democratic characterization we will make, because we have 2 more states, and both of them are going to be tilt Republican. Now, I know many of you are shocked to see Pennsylvania tilt Republican, and this makes sense, because for basically the entire campaign cycle, even going back to 2020, before we even knew any of the candidates or whatnot, when Pat Toomey announced his retirement, people expected this race to go Democratic, just purely because of the fact that, Pennsylvania has elected, Tom Wolf was elected in a red wave year in, I believe it was 2014, I think 2010, despite the nationwide shifts, and this state has been, since 2016 at least, it's certainly trended slightly to the left, after it voted for Trump, and people largely expected John Fetterman to run, who was probably the best candidate, with experience with the state, and then things just got even worse for Republicans as the cycle went on. They nominated a very poor Republican candidate, another reality show celebrity, and they simply kind of fumbled the bag in this race. However, what's changed in recent weeks is actually that John Fetterman way back when, I think it might have been in May, had a stroke. And because of that, he's had some, auditory processing issues, speech impediments, etc. And while obviously none of that's in his control, he's been criticized for it for A, not being transparent, and B, not really being able to fulfill his capacity as a U.S. senator. So because of that, and a recent debate that happened, which was very poor for John Fetterman, this race has actually shifted slightly in the Republicans' favor. As we can see on 5 for 38, their forecast in Pennsylvania, this race used to be at its peak almost an 80% chance of Democratic victory, and now it's 55%. If trends keep continuing in the same way, this race will probably be listed on 538, which, may I remind you, overestimated Democratic support in 2020 and 2016. Then John Fetterman will be expected to lose to Mehmet Oz. So that is why I characterize it as tilt. I think a lot of people have been just kind of giving up on this race for Democrats and saying that it's a lost cause. I don't think it's a lost cause. I think it'll be very close, but I do ultimately expect it to go to Republicans by a small margin. And then the final state of today's prediction is Nevada. Now, this state is a very strange state because it is, as I mentioned earlier, kind of the Democratic counterpart to North Carolina in that it seems very competitive every cycle, but it practically votes for Democrats the same margin every time, like 2.4%. It's actually quite hilarious. In 2016, Hilarious Clinton, sorry, apologies for that pun. Hillary Clinton actually won the state. It was one of the few, tried and tested swing states that she actually won. And then, actually, surprisingly, in 2020, this was one of the few states that Biden did not improve on since 2016. And while that can be chalked up to losing a little bit of Latin support, or Latinx, it can also be chalked up to, Nevada simply having, a voting bloc that outputs the same margin each year, and the margin was practically identical. So, because of that, you may reasonably assume that this will go to Democrats. However, that is actually not entirely the case, because, first of all, of the swing states this year, this is probably the one where the Republicans have fielded the best candidate. Adam Laxalt is by no means a groundbreaking politician, but he is certainly better than Mehmet Oz, Herschel Walker, J.D. Vance, etc. And then the other thing is Democrats have lost a lot of Latinx support over the past few election cycles, so that may end up costing them in this Nevada Senate race. So with that, we conclude our prediction with the Republicans gaining one net seat this cycle with one Senate pickup, and because of that, the Senate will be tied 51-49. Thank you. Bye.